Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association in Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Our speaker today is Ed Zimmer. Ed is a native of Omaha. He has an undergraduate degree in art history and sociology from Lindenwood College in St. Charles, Missouri. He lived in Boston for 11 years and was a freelance architectural historian there. While in Boston, he received a PhD at Boston University in architectural history. In 1985, he returned to Nebraska and became and still is the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Planner. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
Thank you. This will be a bit of a revisit and then an expansion of some past talks when we've spoken about the Historical Society's website, Placemakers of Nebraska, the Architects. And when we say the architects, that's because we imagine there's lots of other placemakers as well, but we don't have to cover them. So it's a limitation. And I give the address there. It's www.e- I don't think that's a dash. A dash should be two of them, so it's a hyphen, nebraskahistory.org. And then it'll take you into placemakers. Dave Murphy's the originator and senior editor of it. He kindly gives me editing privileges as well, so when I find a mistake, I can fix them right then. So whenever I put one of these together, I fix half a dozen mistakes. And you might remember I spoke sometime in the not too distant past on Paul V. Hyland, Nebraska architect who did some significant work in Lincoln. And we actually produced 4 pages about Hyland himself, his various partnerships. These all link together and provide some background on these individuals. And I start with Hyland not because he's a forgotten figure, because I've already spoken about him, so we must know him now, but because just recently his grandchildren, Hyland's grandson and granddaughter, visited Lincoln, and we arranged tours of some of the buildings that he had designed. And they lovely, gracious people. It was great fun getting in the houses with them. And then they sent me Grandpa's portrait. And so now we have Paul V. Hyland's face looking like a callow youth, must be at the very beginning of his career. But he's not that old a fellow as he's working in Lincoln either and building some of our very significant buildings like the Terminal Building, First National Bank Building, what we call the Lincoln Building today, Frank Wood's house on Sheridan Boulevard, McAfee House at 18th and C Streets. So a figure who left a lot of lovely buildings around town, and now we can put his face, which we haven't yet put on the Placemakers website, but we will. What I'm going to focus on today are folks who I hope you haven't heard of, because otherwise I'm all off on my topic. So these are some of the more obscure figures that we've incorporated into placemakers. And I'm not trying just to pick up the oddities, but people that through this process we've learned about who design buildings we know, or who design buildings that we maybe ought to know. And these are figures worth remembering. Some of them just a couple buildings, some of them very briefly in Lincoln, some of them major impact, but a few of their buildings still left. So I'm going to start with Truman Dudley Allen. And if anybody raises their hands and heard of him, then I'll just skip him and we'll move on to somebody else. But I think I'm pretty safe with Truman Dudley Allen. He was from New York, born in 1829, a little older than many of these figures, and had, like many of these, almost all of them I'll talk about, is a career that took him all around the country. He was in Ohio before he came to Nebraska, and he was doing significant work there. He did some courthouses and some high schools, both of which were major buildings in their communities. And then he's in Nebraska, in Grand Island and then Kearney by about the late 1870s. And the first Nebraska building we know of, or the first one I could find a good image of, was the Polk County Courthouse in Osceola, not the later courthouse by Jernan, but the earlier generation. So he's doing big buildings, then comes to Lincoln about 1872, and almost immediately, after securing an office, does the Ledwith Block, which is a building you should not know by that name, but you probably do know as eventually the Sam Lawrence Hotel, on the corner of 11th and P Streets, northwest corner. Starts as a 3-story commercial building, and then has a very scattered history from that point. We'll get in a little closer on it. So it starts as the Ledwith. It's converted into a hotel called the Merchant Hotel by the early 1890s. Closes in the early 20th century and then reopens as the Savoy Hotel. And some of these buildings survived into the postcard era and some of them didn't. But this is the Savoy as it looked about 1908. Savoy then comes into, as a fascinating history of its own, comes into the ownership of L.L. Lindsay, Llewellyn Lafayette Lindsay, or Bud, as his friends knew him. He was an African-American man who had come to Lincoln as a waiter in some of the hotels, eventually acquires a bar and a cigar stand, and then acquires a hotel. And he was the owner of the Savoy and added 2 floors to the top of the Savoy about 1911. And then a canopy gets built on the front later in the teens. It closes for a while in 1931 and reopens as the Sam Lawrence. So that's building we would kind of know up till it was torn down in 1990, and that's where the Embassy Suites is today. So that's the first of Allen's buildings in Lincoln. And we have from some of the early newspapers accounts that Mr. Ledwith was getting ready to build, and he had commissioned plans, and he went to see them in the office of Mr. T.D. Allen. So we have good contemporary documentation that he's the architect there. And then, even more significant, although short-lived building, Allen gets the commission in 1882 to do the Masonic Temple. 11th Street seemed to be his lucky street in Lincoln, at least getting commissions, because now we're down at 11th and M. This would be the corner where the new extension, or the more recent extension of St. Paul United Methodist Church is, northeast corner of 11th and M, and designed and built this fabulous, big, tall Masonic temple with a great tower and a clock on the tower. There are accounts that describe the exterior and the interior. The lodge room was to be 48 by 56 feet and was to be magnificent, and said that the perspective view was a beauty. That is lost. I haven't seen that. By 1883, as it's under construction, there's some trouble on this site. They get the foundation built. Allen orders to be taken out. The rumor was that it wasn't sufficient to carry the tall building. He writes to the paper, "Allow me to correct your local in yesterday's paper in regard to the walls of the Masonic Temple. The wall was not taken down because it was inadequate to support the superstructure or from any lack of strength," because he would be responsible for those things, "but because the mechanics had made a mistake in locating the pilasters and windows in their proper places. The dimensions of the basement walls, as called for by the plans, are abundantly strong to carry the superstructure." In other words, he was saying, not my fault, but they have to correct those walls. Then something occurs in his personal and or professional life, and he leaves town by November of '83. Nebraska State Journal reports a miscellaneous lot of property belonging to T.D. Allen, the contractor, who disappeared a few months ago, was sold yesterday afternoon to satisfy a judgment. The goods brought $5.35. So he had cleared out of town, but not left too much behind. He had married an Omaha woman. She does not seem to accompany him as he leaves town. He goes up to Minnesota and remarries in 1886 in St. Paul, and then has another 10 years of productive work in Minneapolis, does several more courthouses and more high schools. His health is failing in the mid-1890s, and he dies in Wisconsin in 1897. His building lasts barely longer than that. Big, beautiful building, but it goes down in the fire of September 16th, 1899. The newspaper describes it as a bad fire, a very bad fire, and particularly bemoans the loss of the city library that was in rental space in the building. And the paper reports that it created profound sorrow, the loss of the library. All that was saved from the rooms were the classified catalogs. These the plucky librarian, Miss Sarah Burroughs, rescued alone and unaided. She's a hero of mine. She was notified of the fire a considerable time after it started. When she reached the scene, the room was filled with smoke. She begged a bystander to save the catalogs, but no one would volunteer. Not to be daunted, she rushed up the stairway and into the room and brought out the books in triumph. Only one man in the entire crowd chose to follow her, and he waited in the hallway until she came out. And by having the list of books that lost, she could start to rebuild the library from there. And Sarah Burroughs is remembered more than Mr. Allen because the Employee Recognition Award at the libraries is still the Sarah Burroughs Award. And then a very brief contact in Lincoln, but a very lovely building, was Lawrence Bolton Volk, or L.B. Volk, who did one building, First Presbyterian Church on 13th and M, so it'd be the corner of the office building of the Cornhusker Hotel. It shared that block face with the Congregational Church just south of it. And I have one reference just to his last name that said, in a solicitation for bids, for the erection of a church edifice for First Presbyterian Church according to plans, specifications, and detailed drawings made by Volk. And there is one Volk who was in that field, and he was a New York City architect who did churches all over the country. And he did very, very handsome buildings. This beautiful stately tower. There's the plaque on the end of it with the name and the gas light with a little cutout figure identifying what street you were on, so it would shine at night. I think in that, can't quite read it here, but I think in the gas street lamps there were street names. This building survived into the postcard era because it stood until Cornhusker Hotel was to be built, the two churches sold, and First rejoining with Plymouth built First Plymouth up at 20th and D, and First Presbyterian built their new church at 17th and F, both in the late 1920s. Volk was one of the figures that there was available information through various sources, so I didn't try to reconstruct his whole career. Individuals who didn't have that, and I wanted to put them in a context, I gathered as much information as I could, but Volk was pretty well documented. But I did identify on his page two nearby churches in his broad career. He did a church that still stands in Fort Madison, Iowa, and this is United Presbyterian in Fort Madison, built just the same time as First Presbyterian, 1884-85, by Volk. And clearly, these rather unusual towers, he's not doing a simple spire, but really more massy towers were part of his vocabulary, particularly when we look to Colorado Springs, where First Baptist was one of his works. This is a little bit later, 1890-91, but has this unique tower with if it isn't the circular stair feature, it should be the circular stair, but this little tiny spire that goes up alongside the main. Now, if you want to take a new picture of this and match it up to the postcard, you run into a certain difficulty that it's right next to the telecom tower in Fort Collins. I thought that really wasn't the image I wanted to leave of it, so I revolved around a little bit, and you can mask that from one angle behind the tower itself. So that's one solution to the problem. And I feel sort of for Fort Collins, because we've got a tower that I would not have in principal views either when looking down towards the Capitol. So maybe the better way to represent it is the postcard and the stained glass windows, which have a Nebraska connection. This may be Volk's, as far as I know, is the only other Nebraska connection, that it was the Omaha Art Stained Glass Company that produced these fabulous windows in that church, which is still extant. Volk was in New York, metropolitan New York area, metropolitan New York City area for most of his career. Then around 1900 went to Los Angeles and established with his son a continuing architectural operation, principally doing residential buildings. But he also had some interest in, continued interest in churches, and he patented what he called a combination building. And I think it was a combination of a preaching sanctuary and Sunday school space. But this was a patented design by Volk of, he applied in 1901 and got this patent in 1903 for this church plan pattern. Another churchman, and this fellow you might have heard of, but I think he had bigger impact than in Nebraska than most other places, and this is William Wilcox. 2 L's in Wilcox, if you want to get him right. And he was the designer of our second state capitol, which we would know if we visited the cornerstone on the present capitol, because on the corner is the cornerstone for the present building, but right beside it is the cornerstone from the second capitol. So very nicely placed into the wall permanently is this rather beat up and rather hard to read, but in the middle of it, it does say W.H. Wilcox, architect and superintendent. That was a long project. They built the building in 3 stages, starting in the late 1870s and finishing about a decade later. Like the construction of our present capitol, they left the old building, first capitol, in place, put wings on either end of it, and then tore down the center and rebuilt the center, which gives the cornerstone the somewhat odd date of 1884, which is not when they started and not when they finished, but it was when I think the second of the 3 stages began. And I bring this not because you haven't seen the second state capitol, but because I think it was a better looking building than often is depicted. And the postcards seem to me don't always do it justice from the angle. I think it had rather graceful proportions. It looked like many other state capitals, but in this early view, right as it's probably finishing construction by 1889, I think it had rather pleasing lines and a nicely proportioned dome and all of those pieces. So the postcards, I thought, weren't the best way to represent it. 2 other buildings in Lincoln are associated with Wilcox. And one is the rather confusing claim that Wilcox published in 1882 when he did a little book. He never was officed in Lincoln that we can find. He was going from Chicago to Minneapolis and then went to the West Coast through a very peripatetic career in architecture. But he's in Minneapolis area, or St. Paul area, in 1884, and publishes a little book called Hints to Those Who Propose to Build. And I assume the hint was hire me, but he was talking about past work he had done, and he said he had done the Nebraska State Journal building at 9th and P, which Mr. James Tyler also claimed. And the newspapers of the time in Lincoln said it was Tyler's work. Plausibly, they're both right. If Wilcox was not centered in Lincoln and wasn't there to superintend his work, he may have designed it And then Tyler was a architect, superintendent, builder. He may well have been supervising the work of construction, and they may both deserve the credit. But Wilcox does claim this building in his own publication, and it's pretty much contemporary. Tyler is identified as the architect in both Andreas's History of Nebraska and in newspapers of the time in Lincoln. So I would go with both rather than either or, especially because I can't sort out either or. The other building, and a very beautiful one, was the original St. Paul church. And I can call it the original because while there was an older First Methodist on the same location, the name St. Paul wasn't used by that congregation until they built this building about 1885. Cost a substantial $45,000 and was a stone building with a slate roof and should have been all but fireproof. But when the Masonic Temple library burned down right beside it, and they were fighting that fire, confident that the church should be safe because it had a slate roof, the rafter ends, the wooden rafter ends, caught fire just from the radiant heat of the burning building across the alley, and it swept up into the roof and took out essentially the whole structure of the church roof and interior except for the outer walls. Some of those outer walls, or at least some of the stone detail, were incorporated into the present St. Paul Methodist. Some of the little, if you can see that cluster of the three lancet windows with the pointed arches, those occur in the red brick setting of the current 1901 building. So there's a little bit of one Wilcox building sort of still standing on the original site, but not on the original building. So he's been almost extinguished from our community, but did some substantial and important buildings. And we ought to know the guy who did the second state capitol. So he has a very long page tracking him all through his career as best I could find it to let us know who did those buildings that were important to us here. You may have heard of Placey if you're a courthouse fan, because he did several courthouses around Nebraska. But he did a couple buildings that I'd be surprised if you'd heard of, because I was surprised when I found it. And one I can't show you a picture of, but this is one where I'm talking about it in hopes somebody will bring me the picture. He designed the first Quinn Chapel permanent building between 10th and 11th Streets on F, which would sound wrong because they had a subsequent building between 10th and 11th on E, and the building from E Street they picked up and moved to 9th and C, which you don't have to follow, but if you can find for me the first building, which shows up in this bird's eye view of 1889, labeled AM for African Methodist, and then down in the inscription it does identify it exactly as Quinn Chapel, which is the traditional name for that congregation, the first and oldest African American congregation in Lincoln. And in 1889, the Nebraska State Journal reported that the African ME people of the city will soon be worshiping in a new church. The plans have been drawn by the architect Placey. So, and goes on to describe it's a substantial building, 68 by 50 feet in size, with two handsome towers, the largest 80 feet in height. So this was no small church, but I just have not yet found a picture of it. The congregation lost that building and then moved up to a block north, up to E Street from F, and then built on the F Street site about 1900, and then in 1915 moved that brick building about 5 blocks away over to 9th and C, where it is the core of the present building standing there. But that's not Placey's building. Placey's was the one on F Street, or on E Street. No, Placey's was the building on F Street. It eventually became First Evangelical Church by about 1903, and then was Nazarene Church by 1928. And the congregation, the Nazarene congregation that's out on 70th Street, is the descendant of the congregation that had this church up to about the 1940s. So there are there's a kind of terrace buildings on the site today, and I just haven't yet found a picture of the original Quinn or the Nazarene manifestation of it, but it was a Placey building. Placey's more prominent building, and then the question is whether it still stands or not, was the Central Christian Church, right opposite the Capitol on the corner of 14th and L, the one under construction in this 1889 view. And you would say, that's not Central Christian, that's St. Mary's. Well, that's not how it started. Started as Central Christian, and there it is finished, or sometimes called First Christian. They lost it in the economic disruption of the mid-1890s. The mortgage holders took the church by about 1895. It stood empty for quite a time, and then was purchased by the Catholic diocese to become the cathedral. And we can see it in a postcard labeled as the New Catholic Cathedral, and it is Placey's building. Early newspaper account reports clearly that Placey designed the Central Christian Church. Fortunately, that's not exactly the church it's parts of the church that is there today, because to remodel the church, the diocese hires a Milwaukee architect, E. Brellmeyer and Sons, who were doing lots of Catholic churches around, and they were going to do the remodeling into a Catholic facility, and then the construction activity lit it on fire. And in 1906, it burned down it's about as much or more than St. Paul. The tower stood, parts of the walls stood, the whole interior and major parts of the walls were gone. The cornerstone still reads 1888, but it is 1911 before the building's been rebuilt, and it isn't, the tower stands, parts of the walls stand, but the whole structure of the roof, and I bring them both in so we can compare the very complex roof peaks and ridges of the Placey compared to the much simplified form refinished in 1911 to make St. Mary's Cathedral at the time it first opened. So we have Placey designing the church in the 1880s, and then the Milwaukee architect rebuilding it and restyling it somewhat by 1911. And that gives us a vague connection, at least, to who maybe should be the most prominent of these figures in terms of his duration and impact on Lincoln, and that's John J. Butler, who that's a pretty low profile name. If you know Butler, you're into. I wouldn't challenge you in trivia contests of Lincoln trivia if you know Butler, but J.J. Butler has a long career in Lincoln as an architect, and then about mid-1880s he shifts in large part into dealing in real estate. He had been building commercial buildings and residential buildings in the community, and several of them very major structures. He designed in the mid-1870s Centennial Opera House, or Halo's Opera House. Halo had earlier built an opera house. This is on the corner of 12th and O, corner of the Centrum, corner of Energy Square, Southeast Community College. It's where the red solar semaphore sculpture is. That's the corner this sat on. The opera house had burned down. The earlier one had burned down, and the community subscribed funds. And Butler came forward and said he didn't have funds, but he would design it for free for the community. And so he became the architect and superintendent of construction for this wonderful staircase on the side. Exiting is very important in theaters, and they were working hard to accommodate ample exiting for this building. His connection into St. Mary's or into the Catholic cathedral at least, is this building, which stood at 13th and M, which is still, I think would say still, and although there's a motion underway to build this site into something else, but this was St. Teresa Church and then St. Teresa Cathedral before St. Mary's was the cathedral. This is the northeast corner of 13th and M. And Butler designed this in 1878-79. The rear portion behind the little spire was an addition put on in the booming 1880s. And we see it here in context with the Bonnicum Institute beside it, the Catholic High School. That's a John H.W. Hawkins design, but Butler had done that prominent downtown church building before most of the other downtown churches had been built. Notice this St. Teresa is T-H-E. There is a St. Teresa Parish in Lincoln, T-E. This spelling of Teresa was the original name on the Catholic Cemetery in Lincoln, now Calvary, on O to L streets. It was named for this spelling of Teresa, not the parish that it happens to sit in today. But there's a prominent Butler building. And then back over to 11th Street and just across the street west of the Masonic Temple, those commercial buildings on the corner were called the Courthouse Block and the McMurtry Block, and those are 1881, and those are Butler's work as well. This would be the corner of the student housing project called the Latitude, the northwest corner of the intersection. And it was called the Courthouse Block because the county had its offices there before it built the courthouse on the present site of the County City Building. So while these were commercial buildings and privately owned, they provided county offices for a time. And then probably a little more typical of his work, in this view of the north face of the 1200 block of O Street, we see the James Tyler designed Burr Block as the big tall building. But in the middle of the block, Butler started shifting from building for lots of other downtown commercial users, buildings on his own account. And this was the Butler Block that sat in the middle of the block, about where Commerce Court is, or Executive Travel, right about in that part of the block. That rounded cornice was on Butler's own building, and he built a couple other buildings for his own commercial real estate business, and then principally was in real estate until the end of his life in the early 20th century. But I think a last connection we can make to his work is he provided for his family in 1902 a house at the corner of 20th and C Streets, 1200 South 20th, and I don't think this builder architect was having anybody else do his house, and it is a somewhat unusual, it's American Foursquare, but it has a lot of unique characteristics, and I think this is Butler's own probably last project. Now, if you are that courthouse fan and knew Placey from that, his sometime partner on those projects was William Gray, and we might know him from things like the York County Courthouse, which Gray and Placey did together. But I've got a couple other Gray projects that are more obscure. So these would be the forgotten buildings, if not the forgotten figures. This was Mr. Manson's house, or Munson, Charles C. Munson, called it Forest Hill, and it was at the southeast corner of 26th and O, which I think would be a property that a large commercial owner of real estate in Lincoln would own today. How you would call this Forest Hill, there is some hill there on O Street, but no forest, and I don't think there ever has been. But this was Munson's Forest Hill, 1886, and the picture came from a Cornhusker yearbook that was showing the Greek chapter houses that were scattered all around east and south of the campus. And this was Alpha Tau Omega in the early teens. But it was William Gray's design for Mr. Munson. Gray also did, related to campus, what was called Ellen Smith Hall, but was built for Mr. Sheldon, F.L. Sheldon originally. And if you notice those big decorative windows that almost describe a full circle in that arch, you see that same effect on the 11th Street side of Sheldon's commercial building. This sat on the north end of the Latitude building. This would be the southwest corner of 11th and N. A little long, narrow, skinny building here in a rather clumsy depiction, but with bays all down along the length of it, probably a mix of commercial below and residential above. But I'll also point out just to the left of the Sheldon building, or the Sheldon block, a little building called the Stubblefield block, which also was a William Gray design. And the newspapers of the time, it was mentioned that Gray had fired 4 workmen from the site. He was the superintendent of the construction as well as the architect. He apparently fired them because they were African American, and he didn't want African Americans working on his building site. One of them sued that was improper and won the suit. And so here in the 1880s, we had a very early civil rights action that the judge found for the workmen. The newspaper mention said, and there would therefore be other suits that would follow close on its heels, because he discharged 4 men. In the construction of the student housing building on that site, the Latitude building, this came out of the rubble, and I got the assignment of which building did that come from, and it came from the Stubblefield block, because I did find one image, barely, but you could see up near the top, not shown in this sketch, there was a date stone of 1887, and that's where that came from. So this was a survivor, a fragmentary survivor of one of Mr. Gray's buildings. And in this building, which sits right next to Barry's Bar, I have to bring in, sort of by way of confession and correction, because I've published twice now, I believe, that this is the Burr and Muir block by James Tyler, but it's not. It's the St. John building, 1888. I had the date right. The Burr and Muir were just slightly south of it on the gas station site, and had to do deed work and sort out which was lot number what, but this was Gray's St. John building of 1888, still extant, of course, and a handsome, sort of mildly Richardson Romanesque in a commercial building. And Gray also did the early building, the original building for Tabitha out at 48th and Randolph in 1890. So several more obscure Gray works than his courthouses, but pretty wide impact around the community. And then to make sure that, to guarantee that I would bring somebody in that you could not have heard of, I'll bring in Mr. Frederick Richard Yokel, architect, builder, and building engineer. For the longest part of his career, he was the stationary engineer, the building superintendent for the Sharp building. But earlier on, he advertised himself for a few years as an architect. He apparently had not fully decided yet how to spell his name, or his wife decided later on his obituary to spell it differently than this. And so I used the spelling that we find throughout his later life, contrary to his advertisement. But I have a couple buildings by Mr. Yokel during the period he was operating, late teens, early 20s. And a couple of handsome community buildings. One is the lovely little grocery store at 23rd and D. Beautiful brickwork, a very lovely, almost quilt-like pattern of a couple colors, and then each pattern is laid in differently, and just a very handsome little building that was Yokel's. And then at the corner of Normal and A, addressed 3210 Normal, 1923, Mr. Yokel designed and built, and also the three houses marching down Normal south from there, which are not nearly as eccentric as the little corner building, are all Yokel's work. And so he helped make the place that we know, and he's one of our placemakers. And now you can read about him online. With that, I will take questions if you really thought you needed to know more about any of those individuals, and I would get to ask you why. Yes,
I
Ann?
have a question because we have a family member whose last name was Morgan. I'm not sure the first name, but I was always under the impression that he designed the York County courthouse.
And the question from Ann is whether the family story that a relative named Morgan,
Yeah, last name Morgan, yes.
last name Morgan, designed the York County Courthouse. I've always seen it as Placey and Gray together, and would have to look whether there's a Morgan involved in some way.
Well, that just got my attention.
Yeah, well, and let's put our heads together and come up with a first name. Morgan's not
I think it was William Morgan.
William Morgan.
And his wife's name was Anna. Aunt Anna.
It can be very, very helpful to have the spouse's name. Now, Ann, I will forget this as soon as I walk out of the room, so you'll remind me then, and we'll try to look into the Morgan connection. And maybe like the Journal building, it will be that he's involved in superintendence or some aspect of the project.
Thank you.
Other than the sign telling me to repent, I think yes, Ann?
Since we have one more minute, I thought maybe Solomon Beeman might be, he's probably too well known to be mentioned.
We do have Beeman. Solomon Beeman was the architect of First Christian Science Church in Lincoln and the original Banker's Life building, both very prominent buildings of their moment. He was a Chicago architect who did Christian Science churches all over the country, and some other nice work in the Chicago area. S.S. Beeman was, he was Solomon. His son was also an architect, and I believe he was also S.S. Beeman, but not Solomon. So then you end up sorting out.
Solon or Solomon? S-O-L-O-N?
No, I think you're right. It was Solon. Yeah, Solon S. Beeman, and his son S.S. Beeman. Troublemakers. They should have more consideration of researchers when they name children.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.